So tonight is the third class in the doorway with 6 keys. And tonight's class is titled Words from the Wise. In the first class, we talked about the first key to trying to find our way back to Hashem. We explained that the first key is to use difficulties that you're going through and to channel them towards bettering yourself and reconnecting to Hashem. The second class, we discussed using the process of aging as a way to help guide us and lead us towards bettering ourselves. And if you refer back to those, they're available on the podcast. You can review those. Tonight, we're moving into the third key, which is words from the wise. And that key is to find people, especially people who are wiser and learned, to find those people and to learn from them. To look for inspiration from 2 kinds of people. The first are people who know and who are wise. And the second are the people who are there to reprove you. And if you don't have anyone in your life who can call you out on things, then you're in trouble. Every person, says Rabbi Yonah, this is what he considers the third key, every person has to have someone in their life who checks them, who balances them. Otherwise, if you're making decisions only based on your whims and what you want, generally speaking, if we don't feel anyone's going to check on us, we will make the decision which is the more convenient one, which isn't always the right decision. And so the third key is to have someone who is wise, who inspires you, who is learned, who can help you, but also, and maybe they need to go together, to have someone who calls you out on things. And then comes the hardest part. To be willing to accept what they say. And this is very hard. Especially people who have relationships, whether it be spouses, parents and children, siblings. We have this imaginary account for people one-upping each other. So if you make a statement that insults me, you now owe me, and now I'm entitled to say something that insults you. So if someone comes to me and says, you shouldn't have done that, so either they get the response, well, what about what you did? Or another favorite of everyone is, well, you didn't have to say it like that. Or look who's talking, right? All these arguments. And that's us, instead of absorbing the information and listening to people reproving us, instead we are defending ourselves, which is important to do, but first think about whether what that person is saying is right. And if we could do that, we would be different kinds of people. If when people told us, you shouldn't have done that, we can come back later and say, I really felt that the way that you approached it with me was disrespectful, it was condescending, it was insulting. You can say that, but only after. Our immediate reaction shouldn't be that we need to defend ourselves. And so the hardest part, even if you have such a person, is to be able to accept. And says Rabbi Yonah, now remember, he wrote the book. The name of his book is Shari Teshuvah. This is where he says it. So this is the book about Teshuvah. He says that if someone reproves you, if someone tells you off, if someone says something to you, criticizes you, and you accept that criticism and take it seriously, says Rabbi Yonah, that is a level of Teshuvah. Just accepting someone's reproof is already a level of teshuvah. And it's accepted in heaven. And that's where we're going to go tonight. Because what we're going to see is allowing information to be absorbed within you in a way that moves you, even if it doesn't have quite the effect that it has long term, But just that process itself is teshuvah. Because if in order for you to qualify to do a proper teshuvah, you have to actually change all your ways, then none of us have ever done teshuvah. Because I know last year Yom Kippur I said I was never going to do that again. And if someone would have said to me on Yom Kippur, do you want to go do this? I would have said, absolutely not. I'm no longer doing that. I'm no longer talking that way. I'm no longer behaving this way. I'm no longer going to that place. I'm no longer looking at that thing. Whatever the example may be, on Yom Kippur, you would have asked, but then, if it's a week later, you're already at Tzaddik, if a few days go by and you're still with your resolution, you're doing pretty well. But most of us, after just a short time, we go right back to where we were. And some of us wonder, like, in what way am I different this year than I was last year? Was there really that much of a difference? On Yom Kippur, I felt it pretty heavily, so what happened? So according to Rabbi Yonah, that might be true. You need to work on being able to extend all your resolutions and keep them. But you have already accomplished teshuvah as soon as you've been moved inside to feel something and to react to do things differently. And he brings a proof. The proof is in the Mechilta in Parshas Bo. The Torah describes that Hashem says to the Jewish people, on the 10th day of Nisan, you should go and get yourself a sheep, and then keep it for 4 days, and on the 14th of Nisan you shall slaughter it, and it tells us a whole process. Then on that first day, it says, Vayelchu, Vayasu, that the Jewish people went, Vayasu b'nei Yisrael, the Jewish people went, and they did as God had commanded them. Asks the Mechilta, they still have 14 more days where they have to do it. How can you say that they did as God commanded them? Now, some would learn that it's referring to just the buying the sheep. But it doesn't seem that way from the verse. It says in the verse, and the Jews went and they did. Says the Mechilta, from here we see that as soon as a person accepts upon themselves that they're going to do something, and it's a serious acceptance upon themselves, that's considered like you have done it. Assuming that when you accepted upon yourself to do it, you actually meant it, which is not always the case. We say more New Year's resolutions are broken on January 8th than any other day of the year. Because 1 week is the average length. So sometimes it's because a person has taken too much of a resolution. Sometimes you just lose the inspiration. But much of the time it's because there's something missing within the person's original acceptance. They didn't really mean it enough. Because when something traumatic happens and the person accepts upon themselves, like there was a person I know who was texting while driving and got into a serious accident and came out unscathed, and that person was shaken. So when something like that happens, then you undertake, you're never going to do that again. That's a serious resolution. Now, does that mean that person doesn't? I don't know. You have to. Maybe they do. Maybe sometimes they cheat with themselves and whatever. But I'm just saying that sometimes it takes something traumatic in order to create a real resolution. Now, who's going to do that for me? Who's going to provide for me that traumatic experience? We don't want that every resolution we have comes from some harm that comes to us. Rather, if we have people in our lives who are there to provide that traumatic experience for us in the forms of words from the wise. Rabbi Yonah says that this is the meaning of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Now, the truth is, we discussed this Mishnah in Pirkei Avos just a couple of months ago, because this Mishnah in Pirkei Avos came up right before Shavuos, where we read these exact same words of Rabbi Yonah. But I'm going to read it again, because even though Rabbi Yonah is in Shari Tshuva, Rabbi Yonah says the same thing in Pirkei Avos. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, and some of you may remember this, Kol shema'asav merubin mechachmaso. If your deeds are more than your knowledge, then chachmaso miskayemes, your knowledge will be everlasting. Kol shechachmaso meruba mima'asav. But if your knowledge is more than your deeds, ein chachmaso miskayemes, your knowledge will not survive. Now the second half is very easy to understand. If you have more knowledge than you actually do, which means you know a lot, but you do very little. So what happens is your knowledge disappears. This is true of any secular wisdom. Anytime you might be an expert in a certain field, but if you take a few years and you don't open a single book on the subject, things start to go away. If you don't have action, studying or actual practice of something, it goes away. That's easy to give an example of. Someone who has more wisdom than action. You have more wisdom than action, then the wisdom falls away. But what's the other case? What's a person who has more action than wisdom? How can you do more than you know? Because the Mishnah says, if you do more than you know, then your wisdom survives. How can you do more than you know? And I'm going to read this Rabbi Yonah inside because this is such an incredible concept. Shazu ha-mishnah dibra lefi eitza tova na'a umukubelas. This Mishnah is giving you the most wonderful, acceptable counsel that you've ever heard. Shel yesh lo lemi she'einu yodea. If you don't know enough, if you don't know enough how to do the right thing. Shelo yoved nafsho, don't feel bad, don't give up. Sheyikabel al atzmo, just accept upon yourself. Lasos kala devarim, that you will do whatever you learn. Asher yagidu lo achachamim, that you will follow whatever your teachers, your sages teach you. And when you know, you will do them. Umiyad shikabala zu yikabel al atzmo. And if you seriously accept that not that you're going to do everything, but that when you learn it, you will do belevav shalim, and you mean it with a complete heart, ubenefesh chafetza, and with a willing soul. Stress these words. Mala sechar, you get rewarded in heaven. Ki'ilu kibal alav kala mitzvahs, as if you are fulfilling, as if you've accepted all the mitzvahs. That's Rabbi Yonah in Pirkei Avos, and Rabbi Yonah in Shari Tshuva, which is the book we're learning from, uses a little bit of different words, but basically, listen to this. Ki ha'ish asher kibel al nafsho, if you accept upon yourself, believe naman, with a steadfast heart, lishmor velasos al pi Torah, that you will keep the Torah, asher yaru, which you will learn, yesh biyadu min hayom hazeh, you have from this moment, sachar al kol ha-mitzvahs, reward for having done all the mitzvahs. An incredible thing, because it's interesting, because if someone, let's say, is born and lives their whole life religious, so they never made a formal acceptance. They've never said, I am going to observe the whole Torah. So then let's say out of 613 mitzvahs, they've kept 100 out of, let's say, the 150 or the 200 that they're able to keep. So then they have 3/4 or 3/5 of the Torah that they're keeping. But if someone is either not Jewish or not religious, and then makes a formal acceptance of all the mitzvahs, at that moment of their acceptance, they are fulfilling 613 commandments, or they get rewarded for fulfilling 613 commandments. That's what Rabbi Yonah says. Assuming you can bring yourself to a point of inspiration where you're actually ready to receive and accept and fulfill the entire Torah. It's just amazing that Rabbi Yonah would say this. And he explains that's why it was such a big deal, Nasa v'nishma. Nasa v'nishma was such a big deal, and this is what we had discussed before Shavuos. Because if the Jews had said, Nishma v'nasa, we will hear and we will do. So there's a little bit of a condition in that acceptance. That means that we'll hear it, we'll understand it, and we'll do it. So when we hear it, we will then make the choice to do it. Nasa v'nishma means I'm going to do whatever you tell me. Now, nishma, tell me what I can do so that I can do it. Those words, nasa v'nishma, at that point, they'd already fulfilled everything. You just need the nishma so they can get more reward. But they were already on the highest level as soon as they say nasa v'nishma. And Rabbi Yerucham, in his Sefer Das Torah, just from reading his words, it's almost like he throws his hands up in the air and says, I can't believe this. He wants to take all his papers and throw them so that they can fly. He says, I don't understand it. How could you have that a person did nothing, they did nothing, and it's considered as if they fulfilled the entire Torah? Furthermore, says Rabbi Yerucham, it sounds like, from the words of Rabbeinu Yonah, that even if something goes wrong and you don't end up fulfilling those things, you still get rewarded as if you did it. I'll be very clear about this. If someone makes a resolution, what would be a good pre-Rosh Hashanah resolution? They can give tzedakah every day. That's a great example. A person says, I'm going to give tzedakah every day, at that time of the day, by davening, whatever. They're going to give tzedakah every single day. They're going to make it a big deal. If they forget money, they will make sure to make it up somewhere that day. They're going to give tzedakah every day. That's a great resolution and a great mitzvah for someone to do every day. So when you say, that's what I'm going to do every day, now, if it turns out that a week later, you come to davening in the morning and you forgot your coins or your wallet, you don't have anything on you. So what do you say? I'll do it later. And then later goes by, and then evening comes, and the next morning you say, 1 second, I didn't give tzedakah yesterday. You know what that means? And this is what we were mentioning before, that there was something wrong with your original acceptance or your inspiration. So then that means that when you accepted it, you did not get reward as if you did it. Because if it somehow is a reflection of how, but if you forget your wallet in the morning and then something goes wrong and some accident occurs or something distracts you or something that makes it that it was beyond your control, and you weren't procrastinating throughout the day and saying, I'll cover it later, but it was a serious type of thing, then that's not a reflection on your original acceptance. Then you would get rewarded as if you did it. Says Rabbeinu Yonah, so you see from this that what we're saying is that just by being moved the right way, even if you don't end up doing it, assuming that you don't fail out of being lazy or lax in the acceptance, but because of a real circumstance, it's considered as if you did it.
So, distinguish, if you would, between a resolution and a neder, because if I'm not bound by the resolution, I didn't accept it properly, does that mean the same thing would go to a neder, and I'm not bound by that?
No, that's a really good point to bring up. Because when we say a neder is a formal vow, and you wonder, it's a really serious transgression to break a vow. It's even worse to break a shavua, an oath. But even a neder, which is usually translated as a vow, if a person makes a formal neder, he transgresses a negative prohibition in the Torah. And you wonder, why'd you make a neder? Why did you make a formal vow, which if you break, you're going to transgress? We've already got enough mitzvahs. Why create more opportunities for yourself to sin? And that's actually one of the arguments made against people who make vows. It says in Koheles, Tov asher lo tidor misha tidor, it is better not to take a vow than to take a vow and break it. So why did the Torah offer up this opportunity for vows? And the answer is because sometimes we need that vow We need to push ourselves to that level, and the Torah provides it for someone who needs it. It is more than just a resolution, which is just a person saying, I think it'd be good. That's a nice goal. But, if I make a resolution that I'm going to stop eating 4 desserts per meal, and then 4 different kinds of brownie cake come out, I didn't mean it. I meant other than when there's 4 types of brownie. So now I'm making an exception. So I can do that with a resolution, but I can't do that with a formal vow. And so that's why that's there. And that's why you need an oath is even worse. I mean, that's one of the, that's with God's name. And then you're already getting into the 10 Commandments.
So what is the difference between a vow and an oath, and how are they made?
So using the word neder is to take a vow, and using the word shvuah is to take an oath, but that's an oversimplification. I would say the difference would be, in the case of a neder, is where you prohibit the object, while in the case of an oath, you're prohibiting yourself. And there are differences between them. In other words, whether you say that object is prohibited to me, or whether I'm not going to touch that object. And there's other differences, and this is a complicated thing.
To a certain project?
So committing, we generally will suggest that you don't put yourself in a vow, oath kind of thing, unless you really feel like that's what you need in order to push you that extra step. That's what it's there for. But it used to be, 500 years ago, this was one of the biggest issues, was that many people would just throw out vows and oaths in order to, and people will even do this in the world, they'll say, I swear that this is, don't swear that about a fact is only half as bad. But if someone swears that they're going to do something, swear might fall into the category of a vow, and you're binding yourself in pretty tight bindings. And that's why it's become people who are very careful when it comes to mitzvahs. You'll always hear them saying, B'li neder, without an oath, without a vow, because they don't want to bind themselves. And on Erev Rosh Hashanah, people get together and nullify each other's vows. And on Yom Kippur, that's the last thing we do before we enter Yom Kippur, is Kol Nidre, where we undo all our vows, which everybody knows we're really undoing God's vows. But that's a Yom Kippur discussion. So, Rabbeinu Yonah wants to take this into the realm, Yerucham takes this into the realm of the philosophical. He says, you know where this comes from, this concept? There's a very difficult Ramban, Nachmanides, at the beginning of the Torah. It's difficult because he conjures an explanation in the creation of the world seemingly from out of nowhere, Yesh Me'ayin. The Ramban says that when God created the world, rather than God created a heaven and then an earth, and then said, let there be light, and let there be upper waters and lower waters, and then trees and grass and fields and animals, etc. The Ramban explains that God said on day 1, let there be everything. And then as each day progressed, God said, let each one of these things that was already there emerge. That's the Ramban's. Now you read the Torah, it doesn't seem that way. But the Ramban says that God created all of creation on day 1, and then allowed everything to emerge over the next 6 days. Strangely, I would say bizarrely even, what the Ramban actually says is that God, you can look this up if you don't believe me, that God took all of creation, the entire universe, and put it into a tiny, tiny speck. The Ramban says this in the 12th century. He says everything was inside of a tiny, tiny speck, and then from it emerged both heaven and earth, all of the universe. Where did he pull this out from? Strange. It's very difficult. Yeah, absolutely. But that's where the Ramban goes. Says Rabbi Yerucham, now I understand. Because God is teaching us such an important lesson. If you want to get anything done, you have to first have the plan that contains within it the entire structure going forward. You have to have a resolution or a acceptance that you're going to do whatever needs to get done. It all has to be in potential first, and then from it can emerge all the specific details. And in the same way, you'll never get anything done just by taking it in the moment. You have to first have an acceptance that you're going to do everything, and then you bring out portions of that acceptance as time goes on. Interesting philosophical twist on a musar concept. Generally, those two don't come together. But he's saying that acceptance, which creates a potential, and then the bringing it out into reality, the realization, is in order to emulate or simulate the way God created the world. Furthermore, we see from Rabbeinu Yonah that in order for you to accept, in the same case as Nasav and Ishma, what did the Jews accept when they said Nasav and Ishma? Everything. But they didn't know the details yet. So we see from this that accepting, making a general acceptance, if you're moved just in general, and you come before God and say, on Yom Kippur, or Rosh Hashanah, or you don't even have to wait till then, start today. If you accept upon yourself and you say, I'm going to be a better person, in general, that already makes you a better person. Not if you just say the words, but if you actually mean it. And even more so if you're more specific, and you say, I'm going to improve myself in the way I treat others, and you're actually motivated and inspired to do so, then that counts as if you're already doing it. And I'll say this point again, because this is what Rabbeinu Yonah wants. There is no more powerful motivator than going, and you see this all the time. Someone gets up and gives a speech, especially when you have people who represent a certain organization of maybe troubled people or people who are ill, and they come in to tell stories. I remember there was once a person who came to talk to people about the hospitals in Israel, and they were talking about the kinds of patients that come in from the terrorist attacks, and they were trying to raise money. So they were going to pull at the heartstrings of people, and that's what you need to do in order to save lives. Saving lives costs money, so that's what you're supposed to do. But you see how a person comes in with almost no interest to write a check, and then by the end, one spouse is holding back the other spouse, and it goes both ways, holding back the other spouse from signing away their life insurance to this organization because they're so moved. I've seen that. And it's interesting that you'll never have both spouses, because that's part of what they're supposed to do, is hold each other back. And that's the reproof. But you see people get moved like that because speeches, teachings, lectures are meant for us to be moved and inspired to act differently. And we have to be those people who are open to that. So, one of the commentaries writes that it is an obligation for every person to observe the Torah. The Torah, as we mentioned before, 613 commandments, of which most of them, the majority of them, we are unable to perform today. Not only that, but even if we were alive during the times of the temple, most of them would not be performed by most individuals. But we have plenty that we need to perform. And some of them require a lot of knowledge. The example I always like to use is because it's probably the biggest one, is Shabbos. You cannot observe Shabbos if you don't know the laws of Shabbos. I remember giving a class once, and I wanted to use an example of malacha, of prohibited work on Shabbos, which isn't really work, because we use the word work, but it's not work that's prohibited on Shabbos. If I have a jelly bean in my pocket and I'm walking down a public street, a public domain, it's not work. There's 39 different categories. We call them work, but it's really of creative work. So I wanted to use an example of the kind of work that is not really something that most people would picture as work. So I said, for example, moving cabinets around, moving shelves around, bookshelves around, would not be one of the 39 malachas, even though it's very difficult labor. But taking the bones out of the fish, or taking the bad leaves out of the lettuce, would be one of the 39 malachas of borer. So I was saying this in a class, and one of the people said, "It is? Which malacha is that?" So I said, "Well, borer, you're not supposed to pick and choose." And they said, "Really? That's one of..." This is a religious from Jew who didn't know what the 39 malachas are. That's not their fault. I'm sure that things get missed. For everyone. Everyone misses their things, and everyone has their things which they really, I can't do that. I didn't know I can't do that. But I'm just saying Shabbos is a great example of something which if you don't study it, you're not going to know it. Kashrus. Many people, they just follow the laws of kosher based on what they've already been told, and then it turns out after many years they realize that there's something that they've been doing which has been problematic. Now, it doesn't mean everyone now needs to go check and see if everything they're doing is right, but it can happen that sometimes a person does something and they don't know that that's actually a problem. And, we could sit here all day. I see these examples. I know of these things where people do things and it's not that they're doing anything wrong. It just never occurred to them that that particular thing would be a problem. I didn't know you couldn't heat food this way on Shabbos. I didn't know that you couldn't buy this particular item without a hechsher. I didn't know. And so, Shabbos, kashrus, some of the most basic things, requires a lot of study. So, when I hear that, I start to feel guilty. I don't know all the laws of Shabbos. Nobody knows all the laws of Shabbos. You have to spend your whole life learning the laws of Shabbos. So what does that mean, that I'm a mechal Shabbos? So one of the commentaries writes that you would think it should be that way, but not according to Rabbeinu Yonah. According to Rabbeinu Yonah, as long as you have some means by which you learn halacha, as long as you have a plan, a path and way, and when you learn new things, you're going to accept them, so then that's enough. Even when you find out after 20 years of learning, you say, hey, that's a new halacha, let's observe that and make sure we keep it. At that point, it's considered as if the whole time you kept it. Incredible concept. I think, I don't see anyone who says this, but there's a famous teaching that we recite often that reads as follows: Tana de Eliyahu. It was taught in the school of Eliyahu. Kol hashona halachos b'chol yom. Anyone who studies halacha every day, muftach lo shu ben olam haba, is guaranteed a place in the world to come. If you study, they say, since he uses the plural, anyone who studies 2 halachas every day is guaranteed a place in the world to come. Now, 2 halachas can take 30 seconds. How can you earn a place in the world to come? Guaranteed, that's what it says in the Talmud. Anyone who studies 2 halachas every day has a portion in the world to come, guaranteed. Does that mean I can go learn my 2 halachas and then go do whatever I want? But according to this Rabbeinu Yonah, the answer is really simple. It means that if you've put yourself on a path where I don't know everything, but I'm going to start picking things up. I'm not doing everything, but I've got a plan that I'm going to change myself. Maybe, and this is not just not only in the Torah world, but even in terms of personal health. If a person says, well, I'm going to exercise 5 minutes a day, and then eventually I'll get up to an hour a day, you might have spiritually, not physically, but spiritually, you might be rewarded for taking care of yourself as if you did an hour a day, because you've already set up a plan and a system to go. On the contrary, the opposite is true. If you are given the opportunity to be inspired and you do nothing with it, says Rabbi Yonah, you get punished for that. So it's kind of a scary thing. Because if you go somewhere and if you don't know, you're only going to get half the punishment. But if you know and you still don't do it, but he's saying if someone moves you and inspires you and you dismiss it, you get punished because the people in your life who God put into your life to be your inspiration and motivation and critic were put there by God. And if you ignore them, then you are ignoring God's messages. So much like we said in the first class, if someone's going through a hard time, if someone's suffering, and they don't allow it to change them and make them a better person, then when that's actually going to be a complaint against you, why didn't you use that as inspiration? And we said in last week's class, if a person sees signs of aging and doesn't use that as a motivator to adjust their life, then that's a problem. That's a complaint against you. Every time you reach another milestone, you have to take on something new. You have to do more. In the same way, if someone does come to you and says something legitimate about you, an area that you do need to improve yourself on, and you focus instead on what they said and how they're just as guilty, and the look who's talking, or in ancient Talmudic terms, it was when someone said that you have a splinter inside you, the person would say, well, you've got a whole beam inside you, which isn't language we would use today, but it's the same idea. Oh yeah? Well, I know what you did last week, so who are you to tell me off? It shouldn't matter. That's not a valid response. If someone says something to you, and that person is right, you're supposed to accept that, and if you miss that and you fail to accept that, you get punished.
I wonder, is an aspect of the punishment something of the hardening of your heart that would be, that it's a punishment in that you're hardening your heart to further growth?
It's an interesting point. Generally speaking,
versus being humble to
right.
receive.
Things kind of work that way, that usually your sins are your punishments. They end up like your worst punishment is that you're losing opportunities to get better, and that's a shame. So it's hard though. It is hard to accept critique from others. It is very hard, and we'll talk about that in just a minute.
It needs to be somebody that you respect and whose opinion you generally might seek out, or someone that you generally feel.
Right.
If someone who you don't respect says something to you, well, you don't respect
How do you know it's
them.
valid even?
So then you don't even know if it's valid.
Right.
If you question that person's motivations, also.
Now, how do you
But
know
a
it's
person
valid?
who gives.
Let me give you an example. Let's say you're in shul, and your son walks in and says, "Mom, can I go to so-and-so's house?" And you say, well, who's going to be there? Who's that? Now, all of a sudden, someone 2 rows in front of you turns around and gives the loudest shush ever. Like they want that the next shul down the block should know that you were talking and you were disturbing them while they were so connected to God.
If they were so connected, they wouldn't have been so disturbed.
Right. So now, that might be true. So here you have someone who's clearly being obnoxious in the way that they're doing it. You're not supposed to embarrass someone, even if they're talking in shul. Sometimes there are certain shuls that have professional people whose job it is,
Shushers.
right? The professional shushers. Their job is to go over to people and to give that wink and the little thing, because some shuls just encourage talking because that gets people to go. Some shuls are made for socializing. But we're saying in shuls where people are there for davening. And then you have those people who just like to tell other people off. So you have a choice on how to take that from that person. And as we said at the beginning of the class, you can say to that person later and say, I realize that I wasn't planning on the conversation. My kid came in and he wasn't focused on what was around him. He was so focused on this, and maybe I should have taken him outside. But you didn't need to embarrass me publicly. I don't think that was necessary in order to make your point. I do agree with you. I shouldn't talk during davening. You can say that to that person later. But at that moment, and I'm just picking this example, this applies in a million different ways. At that moment, if you say, who does that person think they are? And you don't stop the conversation and move it outside, that means that you've chosen to focus on the fact that that person inappropriately responded, and therefore you're not going to do the right thing, which is technically, if you're disturbing the davening, if it's a quiet part of the davening, especially when people are hearing that interaction, then you've chosen to not accept that particular reproof. So you have cases where someone comes to you and says, I really think that you're not being the best kind of friend to so-and-so. Now, if that person doesn't know what they're talking about, they don't know what the real relationship is, they don't know what I've done, they don't know what that person has put me through in the last 2 weeks, so then I can ignore them because what they're saying is an actual reproof, and I can analyze their words, and I can say, you know what, maybe I haven't been the best friend to that person. But in cases where it's clear that you're doing something wrong, you just don't like the way that person presented it, that's your choice. And the same is true when you have, let's say, an inspirational speaker who gets up to speak. There are people, and there's different kinds of attitudes amongst people, but you find, every shul will have scholars in residence or special speakers. Scholars in residence are usually technically more scholars, and scholars aren't always inspirational. I should say that better. Scholars aren't always trying to be inspirational, or aren't necessarily trying to be inspirational. But sometimes you have a person who's there in order to give, you have a special, especially when a lecture is given in memory of someone, so that person is meant to inspire. And there's some people sitting there analyzing the quality of the speaker. That person's a good speaker, I've heard that joke 3 times already, and focusing on technical aspects instead of allowing themselves to be inspired. And there's a sefer called B'Mesila Ha'ola who says, and you could disagree with this is open for discussion, but this is what he suggests, that phrase this better, being inspired or not being inspired by a person who is inspirational is a matter of choice and free will. Now you could debate this, because you could say that maybe there's just something wrong with that person, or maybe what that person said, which was offensive somewhat, was too much for me to be inspired by that person. I've lost respect for that person. All these different things that you hear people say, they walk away from a lecture or a speech, especially when they're meant to be musar. And I'm not criticizing any particular community, even if it sounds like I am. But I will just say that there are certain communities that have mashgichim or magidim, people whose job it is to give musar. And people will ask that person, they will approach that person and say to that person, I'm at a place in my life and I need someone to tell me off. And that was that person's job. In Europe, every town had a magid, all the big towns. You've heard of the Dubna Magid and of the Kozhnitsa Magid. All these different Magidim, every major city and town had one. There was a professional guy whose job it was to get up in shul and to just give it to the people in the community. There's a rabbi today, famous rabbi in Eretz Yisrael, who is the rabbi of a certain area, of a very large area, who Shabbos Shuvah, the Shabbos between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, gives an hour and a half lecture. The first hour is a typical Shabbos Shuvah drasha. He will then ask all visitors to leave the shul, and only those people who are his congregants and his followers are to remain. And for the next half hour, he lets them have it. It's a private encounter, meaning with just him and his community, and he lets them have it, and they're so glad for it. They want someone who says to them, you're not doing enough, you're failing in this area, I've noticed that as a community we're struggling with this, and he lets them have it. Why are there people who are coming into our shul who, there's actually someone in the Chicagoland area, a rabbi, who said, last week, he got up in shul and said, last week I noticed that there was a new person who came into shul and no one said Good Shabbos to him. This is not who we are. This is not how we are. And he let it fly. And the people were so grateful. And the people in the shul, that shul changed. Now this rabbi is known that that's the way he runs his shul. And the people who come to his shul are people who welcome that because they are people who are generally looking to grow. And people who are looking to grow are looking for someone to respectfully and, even more important, lovingly to point out areas where we need to improve. And what's even greater is that sometimes these Magidim, they would get up. The Klosenberger Rebbe was famous for this. Klosenberger Rebbe was just an incredible tzaddik. He was a survivor from the war, and he came back and rebuilt. And in all his Musar drashas, he used to talk about his own sins, how he fails in this area and he fails in that area, and everyone knew that he was not talking to himself, but he talked that way because I'm not perfect either, is what he was saying. I'm not perfect. In no way am I perfect, even though he was probably as close to perfect as a 20th century Jew could get. But he felt he wasn't perfect, but still we all need to hear these things. And there are certain communities that don't like that. There are certain communities where the role of the rabbi is to entertain and to maybe do a little inspiration, but not for him to tell me how to live my life. And that's a problem, according to Rabbeinu Yonah. That's a failure in our ability to move forward because we're missing that third key to get through the door. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends what he calls malachim, angels, to inspire us. And especially when you have someone who's able to do so, if you do have someone who loves you and cares for you and wants you to have a greater portion in the world to come and is concerned about you, and that person does it in the right way, refusing to have that, to allow that to happen, is a tragedy. And I should say, it could be that it's an even, we have a famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that says, Ezehu Chacham, who is wise? Halomed mikal Adam, someone who learns from everyone. So what does that mean? That means you're really supposed to be inspired by everyone. You're supposed to look at everything that people do. If they do a good thing, then you learn from them. You're supposed to constantly be learning lessons and applying them to life. Kina sofrim tarba chachma, the jealousy amongst scribes, is the greatest way to increase wisdom. You see someone doing something nice and getting recognition for it, and even if they don't get recognition, but you see someone doing something nice and you want to be like that, do it. Don't say, well, I'm just copying them. Go do it. That's the way we're supposed to do it. That's why God invented jealousy. Not that you can want that person's house or that person's car or that person's life. It's so that you can want to be just like that person. You should be jealous of that person's accomplishments. And it should inspire you to do more. But even if you're not going there, at least learn from the people who are wise and learned and who are there to inspire. And it's unfortunate that many communities have taken that approach, that I should be able to choose the way to live my life and no one should tell me otherwise. And that it creates a situation where we end up being stuck where we are, because if we are leaving who we are only to us, we tend to take the easy road, the easy path. And that's not necessarily good for us. Sometimes we need a kick in the back to get us moving. And all of us need someone like that. And there's a sefer called Harotze B'Tshuva, which is a great name for a book, right? The one who wants teshuva. He says that the biggest obstacle to this is pride. Because we feel that I can't have anyone over me telling me more, because that means that I'm less than that person. Or if a spouse tells that one-up thing, or a relative, or a neighbor, or if my neighbor says to me, you left the garbage out until Wednesday, you left the garbage can out until Wednesday, that's not really nice, speaking from experience. So I was never actually told that, but you get that funny look. So you have a choice. You can say, wow, you know what? It looks like it bothers that person. I could say, well, it's your business. It's my part of the street. You can walk by. It's the winter and no one's walking by anyway. I could make all kinds of excuses. Or I could say, you know what? Maybe if that's what people need in order for them to be comfortable, maybe that's what I should do. But if there's a pride involved, which is, who are you to tell me how to be? Or why do you think that you're better than me? Or all the other little prideful arguments that we make to ourselves. He says that's the biggest obstacle to being able to change. And here's something scary. The same sefer, Harotze B'Tshuva, says that God wants to give you a chance. He wants to give you a chance. And we learned in class 1 that one of the most difficult messages that God can send is difficulties in our life, suffering. And he says that God doesn't send us the suffering until he first sends us the messengers. You don't go straight to the big bats. First, God sends you people in your life who are there to inspire you, to motivate you to be better. If you choose not to listen, then God has to step it up. But just like we see in this week's parsha, or in the previous parashiyos, we see that when you go to war, you can't start with fighting right away. First, you have to send messages of peace. You have to give options to the people. So God sends you the helicopter, the boat, all the other simple escapes. If you choose not to follow the messages, there's a statement that Shlomo HaMelech says, L'tzana achas docha mea tochachos. One joke can push away, can overcome 1,000 reproofs. Because mockery, making a joke of things that are serious, is probably the most powerful way to destroy taking things seriously and to be motivated. So inside of us, the things that happen, there's a story, I'm not going to say names because it's not important, but there was a famous chazan, everyone knows in the old days the chazanim weren't necessarily frum, but nevertheless they were very, so there's one chazan who wrote one of the most powerful pieces of chazanas, I don't know if anyone here is into chazanas, but one of the most powerful pieces of chazanas, on Tiher Rabbi Yishmael Atzmo, which describes the process of the killing of the 10 martyrs. Just an incredible piece of chazanas. It's, if you know the meaning of the words and you listen to this chazan, one of the greatest chazanim that we've ever had. And you listen to him say, it's just incredible and so moving. And he was once invited to come before the Belzer Rebbe to do Tiyah Rabbi Yishmael. And in the middle of Tiyah Rabbi Yishmael, he laughed to himself, the chazan. Anyway, they finished the concert and he went back, and the Belzer Rebbe said, I'd like to explain to all of you, he said to his Hasidim, why he laughed. Because this piece of Chazanus is so powerful that he had a moment of teshuvah. And his reaction to get away from it was to laugh at it. And that allowed him to recover himself, return to the song, and go home and eat his cheeseburger, or whatever it was he was doing. But we make jokes and we take things lightly in order not to be inspired. So Rabbi Yohanan finishes, and that's what we'll finish with. The ears, he says, are more powerful at motivating you than your eyes. We would think a picture is worth 1,000 words, but it's not really so. Because music and words, especially the spoken word, which the written word can never accomplish what the spoken word can do. Your ears are the channel by which you can inspire yourself. Listen. When you're driving in the car, put in some Torah, especially people who are motivational, inspirational. It doesn't require deep thought. Just inspiration that allows you, and find and listen when someone gets up to speak, whoever they may be, whatever they may be saying, listen and see what you can learn. When someone talks to you about things that they're complaining at you, focus on those ways that you can improve rather than on what that person is saying. And with that, we can have our third key to bring ourselves back to Teshuvah, to bring ourselves closer to God. In Mitzvah Hashem, we should all be zocha to a Teshuvah Shlema. We will continue in Mitzvah Hashem next week with the fourth and then the fifth and sixth key in the following weeks. Thank you and have a good night.